The parchment crackled like burning skin between my fingers, its ancient fibers releasing the musty scent of centuries-old secrets. I should have stopped there, should have closed the forbidden tome, and returned it to the deepest vault of the Academy of Raya Lucaria where it belonged. But the yellow ink seemed to pulse with its own inner light, drawing my eyes across words written in a script that hurt to read, as if each letter was carved from concentrated madness itself. My name is Aldrich Thorne, and until 3 days ago I was nothing more than a catalogue scribe in the grand libraries of the Academy. My life consisted of endless hours bent over dusty manuscripts, transcribing the mundane records of glintstone research, student enrollments, and supply inventories. The most excitement I'd experienced in my 27 years was discovering a misplaced grocery list tucked between the pages of a treatise on sorcery fundamentals. I was invisible, unremarkable, content to lose myself in the methodical organization of knowledge that others deemed too tedious to handle. The lands between had always felt distant to me, even though I lived within them. While tarnished warriors sought audience with demigods and scholars, pursued the mysteries of the stars, I remained safely ensconced in my corner of the library's 3rd floor, surrounded by the comforting weight of bound knowledge. The shattering was ancient history to me, something that happened to other people in other places. Grace had never called to me, and I had never desired it to. My ambitions extended no further than perhaps one day earning my own private study, complete with a window overlooking the Academy's moonlit courtyards. But the Academy holds secrets that even its most learned sorcerers fear to acknowledge. In the restricted archives, behind doors sealed with glintstone locks and guarded by spectral sentinels, lie collections that predate Queen Renala's reign. Texts from the age when the Greater Will's influence was absolute, before the outer gods began their subtle whispers into mortal ears. I had spent months petitioning Master Librarian Saluvis for access to these collections, claiming I needed to verify certain historical dates for my cataloguing work. The truth was simpler and more dangerous. I had grown bored with my mundane existence and craved something, anything that might grant meaning to my unremarkable life. Yesterday morning, Saluvis finally granted my request. Perhaps he was distracted by his own research into puppet transformation, or maybe he simply forgot that I existed long enough to approve my access without proper consideration. The spectral guards parted like morning mist as I approached with my signed authorization, and I found myself standing before shelves that had remained untouched for decades. The restricted section felt different from the rest of the library. The air itself seemed thicker, pregnant with anticipation and dread. Dust motes danced in shafts of pale light that filtered through windows so old their glass had taken on an amber hue, casting everything in shades of gold and shadow. The books here were bound in materials I couldn't identify, leather that felt too smooth, too warm to the touch, as if it retained some memory of life. Some volumes were chained shut with links of metal that gleamed like captured starlight, while others lay open, their pages fluttering despite the absence of any breeze. I spent the first day methodically working through the outer shelves, cataloguing texts on ancient astronomy and pre-shattering political structures. Standard academic fare if centuries out of date. But as I delved deeper into the collection, the subject matter began to shift. Treatises on the influence of yellow flame sat beside journals detailing correspondence with entities beyond the veil. Personal accounts of scholars who had achieved communion with the burning truth were shelved next to clinical observations of madness as divine revelation. The deeper I went, the more the very architecture of the archive seemed to change around me. Shelves stretched higher than they should have, disappearing into shadows that electric sconces couldn't penetrate. Corridors branched off at impossible angles, leading to alcoves that felt older than the Academy itself. The whisper of turning pages echoed from empty aisles, and more than once I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that scurried away when I turned to look directly at them. It was on the 3rd day, in an alcove so far from the main archive that I'd lost track of how I'd arrived there, that I found the manuscript that would change everything. Unlike the other texts, this one bore no title on its spine, no author's name embossed in gold leaf. It was simply a collection of loose parchments, bound with a cord that looked suspiciously like braided human hair. The cover, if it could be called that, was fashioned from what appeared to be very old wood, though it felt strangely warm and flexible under my touch. The first page contained only a simple warning, written in common tongue rather than the archaic scripts that dominated most of the collection. To seek the yellow flame is to court the end of all things. To understand its nature is to become its servant. Those who proceed beyond this page do so knowing that knowledge, once gained, cannot be unknown. I should have heeded the warning. I should have closed the manuscript, returned it to its shelf, and walked away. But after 3 days of increasingly esoteric texts that danced around their subjects with academic circumlocution, here was something that promised direct answers. The yellow ink seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, and I could swear I felt warmth radiating from the pages themselves. The second page contained a single image, 3 fingers, elongated and twisted, reaching upward from what appeared to be a burning pit. The fingers were rendered in that same yellow ink, but as I stared at the illustration, the ink seemed to move, writhing and shifting like living flame. My eyes began to water, not from strain, but from an intense heat that seemed to emanate directly from the page itself. Below the image, in script so small I had to squint to read it, were the words, "The 3 fingers speak to those who would hear the truth of endings. In the depths beneath the capital, where the roots of the Erd tree cannot reach, they wait for pilgrims who have grown weary of the greater will's false light. Come and be cleansed in the yellow flame that burns away all distinctions, all suffering, all existence itself." As I read those words, something fundamental shifted in the world around me. The temperature in the alcove dropped suddenly, causing my breath to mist in the air, yet the manuscript itself grew almost too hot to handle. The smell of sulfur and burning parchment filled my nostrils, though the pages showed no signs of actual flame. Most disturbing of all, I began to hear something that might have been whispering, or might have been the sound of fire consuming dry leaves, coming from somewhere very far away, and yet impossibly close. My hands trembled as I turned to the third page, knowing I should stop, but unable to resist the compulsion that had taken hold of me. The yellow ink seemed to have spread, bleeding beyond the confines of the original text, to form new words, new images that hadn't been there moments before. A map began to take shape, showing the sewers beneath Leyndell, the royal capital, with a path marked in that same pulsing yellow that led deep into the earth, far below even the ancient catacombs. At the bottom of the page, in handwriting that looked suspiciously like my own despite being written in that yellow ink, were the words, "The Cathedral of Forsaken awaits. The flame hungers for new servants. Come to us, Aldrich Thorn. Come and learn what it truly means to burn." I dropped the manuscript as if it had stung me, watching in horror as it landed open on the stone floor. The pages fluttered in that impossible breeze, and for just a moment I could have sworn I saw those 3 twisted fingers reaching up from the pages themselves, not merely as an illustration, but as something real, something present, something that was trying to grasp me through the medium of forbidden knowledge. That was when I knew my old life was over. The yellow flame had already begun to burn within me, kindled by curiosity and fed by the terrible knowledge I had consumed. As I fled the archive, leaving the manuscript behind but carrying its contents burned into my memory, I could feel something fundamental changing in the way I perceived the world around me. The familiar corridors of the academy looked different now, tinged with shadows that hadn't been there before. The golden light of the glintstone torches seemed harsh and false, a poor imitation of a truer illumination that waited somewhere far below the earth. And in the distance, carried on wind that touched no one but me, I could hear the sound of 3 fingers tapping against stone, keeping rhythm with my frantically beating heart. Sleep became my enemy after that first encounter with the yellow flames. Every time I closed my eyes, I found myself standing in corridors that couldn't exist, their walls carved from living bone that pulsed with a heartbeat not my own. The familiar comfort of my modest quarters within the Academy's residential wing transformed into a prison of unwanted visions. My narrow bed, once a sanctuary of peaceful rest, now felt like an altar upon which my sanity was being slowly sacrificed to forces I was only beginning to comprehend. The nightmares always began the same way. I would find myself back in that forgotten alcove, but the manuscript was no longer lying on the stone floor where I had dropped it. Instead, it hovered in the air before me, its pages turning of their own accord, revealing new passages written in that pulsing yellow ink. The words burned themselves into my vision even after I jerked awake, gasping and drenched in cold sweat that carried the distinct scent of sulfur. "The flame calls to those who have tasted knowledge," the dream text would whisper directly into my consciousness. "3 fingers point the way to truth. In the depths where the greater will's light cannot reach, salvation waits for the worthy." During my waking hours, I tried to maintain some semblance of normality. I reported to my cataloguing duties each morning, took my meals in the Academy's common dining hall, and attempted to lose myself in the routine tasks that had once provided such comfort. But the mundane world felt increasingly fragile, like a thin veneer over something vast and hungry that writhed just beneath the surface of reality. My colleagues began to notice the changes almost immediately. Master Librarian Seluvis pulled me aside after I was found staring blankly at a page for over an hour, the quill in my hand having traced the same symbol, 3 twisted fingers reaching skyward, over and over, until the parchment was saturated with black ink. "You look unwell, Aldrich," he observed, his pale eyes studying me with the clinical detachment of a scholar examining an interesting specimen. "Perhaps you should take some time away from your duties. The restricted archives can be taxing for those unaccustomed to their contents." I wanted to confide in him, to explain what I had seen and felt, but every time I opened my mouth to speak of the yellow flames, my throat would constrict, as if invisible hands were choking off my words. Instead, I managed only a hoarse whisper. "The knowledge, it changes you, doesn't it?" Seluvis's expression shifted subtly, and for just a moment, I caught something that might have been recognition flickering behind his eyes. "Knowledge always comes with a price," he replied carefully. "The question is whether the seeker is prepared to pay it." That afternoon, I made a decision that would prove to be my point of no return. Instead of returning to my quarters to rest, as Seluvis had suggested, I found myself walking through the Academy's lower levels, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name toward the section of the library where the manuscript still waited. The spectral guards made no move to stop me. Indeed, they seemed to part before me reached them, as if recognizing something in me that granted automatic passage. The manuscript lay exactly where I had dropped it, but it was no longer the same collection of ancient parchments I had fled from days before. New pages had somehow inserted themselves into the binding, and the yellow ink had spread like an infection across surfaces that had been blank before. Maps of the lands between covered page after page, but these were maps unlike any I had seen in the Academy's official collections. They showed not just the surface geography, but the hidden spaces beneath, the sprawling network of sewers and catacombs that honeycombed the earth below Landel, ancient chambers that predated even the Erdtree's dominion, and at the very center of it all, a cathedral marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly. As I studied the impossible maps, I became aware that I was no longer alone in the alcove. The shadows in the corners had taken on weight and presence, and I could hear the soft whisper of robes against stone, though I saw no one when I turned to look. The temperature dropped until my breath came in visible puffs, yet the manuscript itself radiated a heat so intense that holding it became painful. "You return to us," a voice spoke from everywhere and nowhere, its words seeming to bypass my ears entirely and resonate directly in the bones of my skull. "The flame has marked you. You carry our gift within your flesh now." I tried to speak, to demand answers or beg for release, but found that my voice had abandoned me entirely. Instead, I watched in growing horror as my own hands moved without my conscious direction, turning the pages to reveal new horrors. Detailed anatomical drawings showed human figures in various stages of transformation, their eyes melting into pools of yellow fire, their flesh marked with brands that resembled the 3-fingered symbol I had been unconsciously drawing. "This is what you will become," the voice continued, and I realized with mounting dread that it was no longer coming from the shadows around me. It was coming from inside my own head, speaking with my own voice, but expressing thoughts that were not my own. "The barriers between self and flame will dissolve. You will carry our message to the surface world, and in time you will help us cleanse all existence of the greater will's false light." The final page of the manuscript contained not words or images, but a mirror. As I stared into its yellowed surface, I saw my own reflection. but changed. My eyes, normally a mundane brown, now flickered with inner fire. Fine lines of yellow light traced patterns beneath my skin, following the paths of my veins like a secondary circulatory system designed to carry liquid flame instead of blood. Most disturbing of all, I could see the faint outline of a hand-shaped brand beginning to form on my forehead, its three-fingered pattern still ghostly pale, but growing more distinct with each passing moment. I stumbled backward from the manuscript, but the damage was already done. The knowledge had been consumed, and once knowledge enters the mind, it cannot be unknown. As I fled the archive for what I knew would be the final time, I carried with me not just the memory of what I had seen, but the growing certainty that I was no longer entirely human. The changes accelerated over the following days. Food began to taste like ash in my mouth, while the Academy's carefully regulated temperature felt insufferably cold against my skin. I found myself unconsciously seeking out the warmest places in the building. The kitchens where great fires burned to prepare meals, the forge where maintenance tools were repaired, even the uncomfortable proximity of the glintstone furnaces in the basement levels. More disturbing still were the reactions of others to my presence. Conversations would halt when I entered a room, and I began to catch people staring at me with expressions of unease that they couldn't quite explain. My reflection in mirrors grew increasingly unreliable, sometimes appearing normal, other times showing that same yellow-eyed figure I had seen in the manuscript's final page. The dreams grew more vivid and more specific. I could see the exact route I would need to take through Lendel's sewers, past the merchants who huddled in the darkness, selling their wares to creatures that no longer remembered how to walk in sunlight. I knew which passages would lead me deeper underground, beyond the reach of the Erd tree's roots, into chambers where the three fingers waited with the patience of entities that existed outside the normal flow of time. On the 7th night after my first encounter with the manuscript, I made the decision that would sever my final ties to my old life. I packed nothing. The yellow flame whispered that I would need nothing from my former existence, and walked out of the Academy of Raya Lucaria under cover of darkness. The guards at the gates looked right through me, as if I had already begun to fade from their perception of reality. As I stood on the road leading toward Lendel, the royal capital, I felt the last of my human doubts dissolve like smoke in the wind. Behind me lay 27 years of mundane existence, of cataloguing other people's discoveries, and finding meaning in the organization of knowledge I would never truly understand. Ahead lay a pilgrimage that would transform me into something else entirely, something that served purposes far greater and more terrible than any human ambition. The yellow flame had chosen me, and I had chosen to answer its call. There could be no turning back now, even if I had wanted to. The brand on my forehead pulsed with each heartbeat, visible now even in reflective surfaces, and I could feel the three fingers' attention focused upon me with the intensity of a burning lens. I began walking toward the capital, toward the sewers that would carry me deeper underground than any surface dweller had ever ventured, toward a cathedral where I would learn the true meaning of transformation. With each step, I could feel my old self falling away like shed skin, making room for whatever I was destined to become. The flame hungered, and I was eager to feed it. The sewers beneath Lendel reeked of centuries-old decay and something else, something that made my newly awakened senses recoil even as they were irresistibly drawn to it. The stench was not merely that of human waste and stagnant water, but of dreams that had rotted in the dark, of hope that had curdled into despair, of sanity that had been left to ferment in spaces where sunlight had never touched stone. Each breath I took as I descended through the maintenance grates felt like swallowing liquid corruption, yet my transformed physiology seemed to crave it like a drug. The journey from the Academy to the royal capital had taken 3 days, though time had become increasingly meaningless to me. The yellow flame that now burned behind my eyes had altered my perception of the world in ways I was still struggling to comprehend. Distance seemed to compress and expand without warning. I would take a single step and find myself miles further along the road, then walk for what felt like hours, only to discover I had barely moved at all. The sun and moon wheeled overhead in patterns that defied natural law, sometimes racing across the sky so quickly that day and night strobed like a failing torch, other times hanging motionless for so long that I began to wonder if time itself had stopped. Other travelers on the road gave me a wide berth, though most seemed unable to look directly at me. Merchants would suddenly discover urgent business in the opposite direction when they spotted me approaching. A group of tarnished warriors, their armor still bearing the fresh scars of recent battles, actually drew their weapons when I passed within 50 yards of their camp, though they could not explain what had triggered their alarm when I was far enough away for them to think clearly again. By the time I reached Lanedell's outer districts, the physical changes in my body had become impossible to ignore. My skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality that allowed the yellow veins of fire beneath to show through like a network of burning rivers. My fingernails had grown longer and sharper without my noticing, and when I accidentally cut myself on a piece of broken masonry, the blood that flowed from the wound glowed with the same sickly yellow light that now served as my vision in the darkness. Finding the entrance to the sewer system proved easier than it should have been. The manuscript's maps had burned themselves into my memory with such clarity that I could navigate the capital's labyrinthine streets as if I had lived there all my life. I knew which alleyways to take, which manholes would grant access to the passages I needed, which guards to avoid, and which ones the flame had already touched with enough madness that they would ignore my presence entirely. The first tunnel I entered dropped me into a world that existed in complete opposition to the grand architecture above, where Lendell's streets were paved with golden stone and lined with monuments to the greater will's glory. The sewers were carved from raw earth and lined with materials that I preferred not to identify too closely. The walls wept with moisture that left stains in patterns resembling twisted faces, and the floor was covered with a layer of sludge that seemed to squirm and writhe when I wasn't looking at it directly. My newfound ability to see in absolute darkness revealed horrors that would have driven my former self to immediate madness. The sewers were not empty. Things lived down here, things that had once been human, but had been changed by prolonged exposure to forces that leaked up from even deeper levels. I passed huddled forms that might have been merchants once, their bodies elongated and twisted, their faces bearing too many eyes that tracked my movement with desperate hunger. They whispered to me in voices like grinding bone, offering to trade their accumulated treasures for just a taste of the flame I carried within my flesh. "Please," one of them croaked, extending fingers that had grown too long and developed too many joints. "Just a touch of the yellow light. We've been so cold down here, so cold for so very long." I understood then that these creatures were not enemies, but pilgrims like myself who had attempted the journey to the Three Fingers, but had lacked the strength to complete the transformation. They had become trapped in a liminal state between human and something else, condemned to exist in the spaces between sanity and revelation for as long as their corrupted flesh could sustain them. The deeper I went, the more the architecture began to change. The roughly hewn tunnels gave way to passages that had clearly been constructed with purpose, their walls covered in carvings that hurt to look at directly. The symbols were not quite the same as those I had seen in the manuscript, but they shared a fundamental wrongness that made my eyes water and my mind recoil. Some depicted scenes of transformation, human figures with their flesh peeling away to reveal interior structures that defied anatomy. Others showed great ceremonies conducted before altars shaped like enormous hands, with congregants throwing themselves into fires that burned with familiar yellow light. As I followed the manuscript's mapped route deeper underground, I began to encounter other pilgrims who were further along in their transformation than the wretched merchants above. These beings moved with purpose through the tunnels, their human features still recognizable, but overlaid with changes that spoke of contact with forces beyond mortal comprehension. Their eyes burned with the same yellow fire as my own, and when our gazes met, I felt a connection form between us, a shared understanding that transcended language or conscious thought. One of them, a woman whose skin had begun to crack and reveal the golden flame beneath, spoke to me as we passed in a tunnel so narrow we had to press against each other to continue. "You're new to the flame," she observed, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from multiple throats, speaking in perfect unison. "I can smell the fear still clinging to your transformed flesh. How long since you first heard the Three Fingers calling?" "Days," I replied, surprised that I could still speak at all. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, carrying those same impossible harmonics that suggested something fundamental had changed in the structure of my throat. Maybe weeks. Time has become difficult to track. She laughed, and the sound was like glass breaking in a furnace. Time is an illusion maintained by the greater will to keep its subjects trapped in linear thinking. Down here, in the spaces between spaces, we begin to understand the true nature of existence. Past, present, and future are all burning together in the same eternal flame. As she spoke, I watched in fascination as the cracks in her skin widened slightly, allowing more of that inner light to spill out into the tunnel around us. The effect was hypnotically beautiful, like watching a living constellation rearrange itself according to rules that transcended human mathematics. "How much further?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. The pull I felt toward the cathedral had grown stronger with each level I descended, until it was no longer a gentle compulsion, but a raging hunger that threatened to consume what remained of my conscious will. "Not far now," she replied, gesturing toward a passage that branched off to our left. "But remember, pilgrim, the three fingers do not grant their gift lightly. They will test you, push you to the very limits of what your transforming mind can endure. Many who reach the cathedral are found wanting. Their flesh feeds the flame, but their consciousness is scattered like ash on an unfelt wind." I thanked her and turned toward the passage she had indicated, but she caught my arm with fingers that were now more like elegant claws. The contact sent a jolt of shared sensation through both our transformed nervous systems. For a moment I experienced her memories of the journey, felt the ecstasy and agony of her own transformation as if it were happening to my own body. "One more thing," she whispered, her multiple voices blending into a sound like singing fire. "When you stand before the three fingers, when they offer you the choice between salvation and damnation, remember this: there is no difference between the two. The flame that destroys is the same flame that purifies. Embrace the ending, pilgrim. It is the only truth that matters." She released my arm and continued down her own path, the light from her transformed flesh gradually fading until she was lost in the labyrinthine darkness. I stood alone in the tunnel, feeling the weight of her words settling into my consciousness like sediment in still water. The fear that had been my constant companion since leaving the academy began to transform into something else. Not courage exactly, but a kind of fatalistic acceptance that felt almost like peace. The final stretch of tunnel leading to the cathedral was unlike anything I had encountered before. The walls were not carved from stone or earth, but seemed to be composed of some organic material that pulsed with the rhythm of a vast, sleeping heartbeat. Veins of yellow light ran through the surface like a circulatory system designed to carry liquid fire instead of blood, and the air itself felt thick with potential energy, as if reality had become unstable in this deep place where the greater will's influence could not reach. As I walked through that final passage, I felt the last vestiges of my human identity beginning to dissolve. The man named Aldrich Thorne, who had spent his life cataloguing other people's discoveries and finding meaning in the organization of mundane knowledge, was becoming something else entirely. Something that served purposes far greater and more terrible than any mortal ambition. Ahead I could see a faint glow that promised the end of my journey and the beginning of my true transformation. The Cathedral of the Three Fingers waited in the darkness ahead, and I walked toward it with the eagerness of a moth flying into flame, knowing that I would emerge from that encounter fundamentally changed if I emerged at all. The yellow fire burned brighter with each step, and I embraced its heat like a long-lost lover welcoming me home. The Cathedral of the Forsaken opened before me like the interior of a vast, beating heart. The architecture defied every principle of engineering I had learned during my years among the Academy's scholarly texts. Walls curved impossibly inward and outward simultaneously, creating spaces that seemed larger from within than their external dimensions could possibly contain. The ceiling stretched upward into darkness so complete that it felt less like the absence of light, and more like the presence of something that actively consumed illumination, leaving only the sickly yellow glow that emanated from the very stones themselves. But it was not the impossible geometry that stopped me in my tracks as I crossed the threshold. It was the presence that filled every atom of air in that accursed space, ancient beyond mortal comprehension, alien in ways that made my transformed mind recoil, even as it was irresistibly drawn forward. The three fingers were here, not merely as entities that inhabited this place, but as forces so fundamental to its existence that the cathedral itself was merely an extension of their will, made manifest in physical reality. The floor beneath my feet was not constructed from any material I could identify. It felt organic, warm to the touch, and yielded slightly with each step as if I were walking across the surface of some enormous sleeping creature. Patterns were carved into its surface, or perhaps had grown from within, that traced spiraling paths leading toward the center of the chamber. As I followed these patterns, I began to understand that they were not merely decorative. They were a map of transformation, showing the stages through which human consciousness must pass in order to comprehend the true nature of the Frenzied Flame. Around the chamber's perimeter, massive pillars rose from floor to that impossible ceiling, each one carved to resemble a gigantic finger. But as I drew closer to examine them, I realized with growing horror that they were not carvings at all. They were actual fingers, scaled up to architectural proportions, their surfaces bearing the ridges and whorls of fingerprints large enough for a human being to walk through. The flesh was not stone, but something that had once been living tissue, preserved in a state between life and death through methods I did not want to contemplate. At the very center of the cathedral stood an altar that defied every law of physics and anatomy I had ever learned. It appeared to be constructed from a single massive hand, but a hand with 3 fingers instead of 5, each digit as thick as a tree trunk and longer than a grown man was tall. The palm faced upward, creating a basin-like depression that glowed with inner fire, and it was from this central point that all the yellow light in the cathedral emanated. But it was what stood behind the altar that finally shattered what remained of my sanity. The 3 fingers themselves were not separate entities, as I had somehow imagined. They were manifestations of a single being so vast and incomprehensible that my human-derived consciousness could only perceive the smallest fraction of its true nature. What I saw rising from the space behind the altar was a hand of proportions that belonged to a creature the size of a mountain, its 3 fingers reaching up toward that light-devouring ceiling with an elegance that was simultaneously beautiful and utterly terrifying. The skin, if it could be called skin, was not flesh as any earthly creature possessed, but something that seemed to be woven from concentrated madness and solidified flame. Patterns moved across its surface like living tattoos, forming symbols that shifted and changed, even as I watched, spelling out truths in languages that predated human speech. Where I expected to see fingernails, there were instead crystalline structures that captured and refracted the yellow light into hypnotic patterns that threatened to trap my consciousness in their endless recursions. As I stood transfixed before this impossible vision, the 3 fingers began to move. The motion was subtle at first, a slight curl to the massive digits, a barely perceptible shift in their positioning. But as the movement continued, I realized that they were not simply moving randomly. They were forming signs, creating configurations that spoke directly to the transformed portions of my consciousness, bypassing the need for language or rational thought. The first message they conveyed was one of welcome, but welcome tinged with a hunger so vast that it made my newly awakened appetite seem like the mildest preference. They had been waiting for me, specifically me, for longer than human civilization had existed. My journey to this place had not been the result of random curiosity or academic accident. It had been orchestrated across centuries by intelligence that operated on timescales incomprehensible to mortal minds. The second message brought understanding that I wished I could reject, but which settled into my consciousness with the inevitability of falling stone. The greater will, the entity that had shaped the lands between according to its cosmic design, was not the ultimate power that most inhabitants believed it to be. It was merely one voice in a vast chorus of outer gods, each seeking to impose their own vision of reality upon the material universe. The Golden Order, the Erd Tree, the very concept of grace itself, all were simply tools employed by the greater will to maintain its dominance over a realm that rightfully belonged to forces far older and more fundamental. The third message revealed the true purpose of the Frenzied Flame. And it was here that whatever remained of my human compassion screamed in protest before being systematically burned away by yellow fire. The flame did not seek to replace the greater will's order with a different order. It sought to end the very concept of existence itself, to return all of creation to the perfect unity that had existed before consciousness first learned to distinguish between self and other, before the cosmic forces had begun their eternal struggle for dominance. This was not mere destruction. Destruction implied that something would remain afterward. This was annihilation so complete that even the memory of existence would be erased, leaving behind a state of perfect, eternal peace in which no entity would ever again suffer the burden of awareness or the pain of separation from the universal whole. As these revelations flooded through my transformed consciousness, the three fingers began to descend toward me. The movement was slow, deliberate, giving me time to fully comprehend what was being offered. This was my chance to reject the gift, to flee back through the tunnels and sewers to whatever remained of my former life. But even as that possibility presented itself, I knew it was an illusion. The yellow flame had already burned too deeply into my essence. I could no more turn away from the three fingers than a river could choose to flow uphill. The massive digits stopped just above my head, and I could feel the heat radiating from their impossible flesh like standing too close to a forge. When they spoke, not with voices but with meaning that bypassed my ears entirely and resonated in the transformed structures of my nervous system, the words carried the weight of absolute truth. Child of the Academy, the communication began, and somehow they knew everything about my former life. My decades of cataloguing other people's discoveries, my desperate hunger for meaning in a existence that had seemed increasingly hollow. You sought knowledge, and knowledge has brought you to us. But the wisdom we offer comes with a price that cannot be unpaid. I tried to speak, to ask what price they demanded, but found that my voice had abandoned me entirely. Instead, my thoughts formed themselves into words that seemed to echo in the cathedral's impossible acoustics. What would you have me become? Our herald, came the response, and with it, visions flooded my consciousness. I saw myself transformed beyond any semblance of humanity, my flesh becoming a conduit for the frenzied flame itself. I saw myself walking among the surface dwellers, spreading the yellow fire with every word I spoke, every person I touched. I saw the Erd tree burning like a cosmic torch, its golden light consumed by flames that sang with the voices of every consciousness that had ever suffered the burden of individual existence. But the choice must be made freely, the three fingers continued. We do not take servants. We create apostles who embrace their mission with the full understanding of what they are choosing to become. The largest of the three fingers moved closer, its tip hovering inches from my forehead. I could see now that the crystalline structure at its end was not merely decorative. It was a branding iron designed to burn away the last vestiges of my human identity and replace them with something that could serve purposes beyond mortal comprehension. If you accept our gift, they explained, you will become our voice in the world above. You will carry the flame to those who are ready to embrace the ending of all things. But understand this. Once the brand is placed, there can be no return to what you were. Aldrich Thorne will cease to exist, and in his place will stand something that serves only the cause of ultimate unification. As I stood there, feeling the heat from that cosmic branding iron warming the skin of my forehead, I experienced a moment of perfect clarity. I saw my entire life spread out before me like pages in a book. 27 years of small disappointments and smaller victories, of cataloguing other people's achievements while contributing nothing of my own to the sum of human knowledge. I saw the decades that would stretch ahead if I somehow managed to flee this place, returning to my desk in the Academy's library to spend the remainder of my existence organizing information that would be forgotten within a generation of my death. Against that vision of mundane mortality, the three fingers offered something infinitely more significant. Yes, it would mean the end of everything I had ever known or loved. But it would also mean that I would finally matter, that my existence would serve a purpose greater than any individual ambition. The choice, when it came, felt less like a decision and more like a recognition of what had always been inevitable. From the moment I had first opened that cursed manuscript in the Academy's restricted archives, this moment had been approaching with the certainty of sunrise. I had been selected, groomed, and guided toward this exact instant when I would either embrace my destiny or prove myself unworthy of the power being offered. I lifted my head, meeting the incomprehensible gaze of the three fingers, with eyes that now burned with the same yellow flame that would soon consume everything I had ever been. "I accept," I whispered, and the words echoed through the cathedral with the finality of a funeral bell. The massive finger descended toward my forehead, and as its crystalline tip made contact with my flesh, the universe exploded into yellow fire and screaming revelation. The pain that followed the three fingers' touch was beyond any human vocabulary to describe. It was not merely physical agony, though my flesh felt as if it were being simultaneously frozen and incinerated. It was not simply psychological torment, though my mind experienced the dissolution of every concept and memory that had once defined my sense of self. This was ontological suffering, the fundamental restructuring of my very existence at levels so basic that I had never before realized they could be altered. The brand burned itself into my forehead with the slow precision of a cosmic ritual. Where the crystalline tip of that massive finger touched my skin, reality itself began to unravel and reweave according to patterns that served the Frenzied Flame's vision of ultimate unity. I could feel the cellular structure of my flesh changing, each molecule being torn apart and rebuilt, according to blueprints that had been inscribed in the fundamental laws of existence long before the first star had ignited in the primordial darkness. But the physical transformation was merely the outermost layer of what was happening to me. As the three fingers' power flowed through the brand and into my nervous system, I felt my consciousness expanding in directions I had not known existed. The narrow confines of human perception, the limited spectrum of light my eyes could detect, the restricted range of sounds my ears could process, the crude chemical recognition my sense of smell provided, all of these barriers dissolved like ice in a furnace. Suddenly I could perceive the entire electromagnetic spectrum as a symphony of colors that had no names in any mortal language. I could hear the conversations of entities that existed in the spaces between atoms, their words carrying information about the true structure of the universe that mortal science had never even suspected. Most overwhelming of all, I could smell the emotions and intentions of every living thing within miles of the cathedral, their fear and hope and desperation creating an olfactory landscape so complex and detailed that it threatened to drive what remained of my human sanity into complete collapse. The visions began as the brand reached completion, each one searing itself into my transformed consciousness with the clarity and permanence of direct experience. I saw the history of the lands between as the three fingers understood it, not the sanitized version taught in the Academy's history classes, but the raw truth of cosmic forces struggling for dominance over a realm that served as their battleground. I witnessed the arrival of the greater will, its golden light burning away older truths and establishing the tyranny of order that would eventually become the Golden Order. I saw the Elden Ring forged from the crystallized ambitions of a god that sought to impose its vision of perfection upon the chaotic beauty of untamed existence. I watched civilizations rise and fall according to scripts written by entities that viewed mortal suffering as acceptable collateral damage in their pursuit of universal dominance. But I also saw deeper truths, secrets that even the most learned scholars of the Academy had never suspected. The greater will was not the first cosmic force to claim dominion over these lands. Before its golden light had ever touched the soil, other gods had ruled here, gods of blood and rot and madness, whose influences still lingered in the deepest places where the Erd tree's roots could not reach. The Frenzied Flame itself was not a recent development, but the last remnant of an even more ancient power that had once sought to free existence from the endless cycle of cosmic tyranny by ending existence altogether. As these visions flooded through my expanding consciousness, I began to understand my role in the greater design. I was not merely a servant or apostle of the three fingers. I was to become a living embodiment of the Frenzied Flame itself, a walking conduit through which its power could manifest in the world above. Every person I encountered would feel its influence, whether they recognized it or not. Every word I spoke would carry within it the seeds of ultimate dissolution, planted in the minds of those who were ready to embrace the ending of all suffering through the ending of all existence. The physical changes that accompanied this revelation were as dramatic as they were irreversible. My skin began to crack along lines that followed the pathways of my nervous system, revealing the yellow fire that now flowed through my veins like liquid light. My eyes became windows into the flame itself, their human brown consumed by yellow radiance so intense that looking directly into them would trigger madness in any mortal observer. My hair transformed from mundane brown to flowing strands that resembled molten gold, each strand moving independently as if stirred by winds that existed in dimensions beyond the physical. But the most profound change was happening to my hands. As I watched in fascination rather than horror, my fingers began to elongate and multiply. What had once been 5 normal human digits on each hand became 3 impossibly long, elegant appendages that ended in crystalline tips identical to those I had seen on the 3 fingers themselves. These new hands were not merely tools for manipulation of physical objects. They were instruments of transformation, capable of touching the deepest levels of consciousness and rewriting the fundamental code of any mind they encountered. As my metamorphosis reached its climax, the 3 fingers began to communicate with me in a new way. Instead of the previous method of meaning resonating directly in my consciousness, they now spoke through the transformed structures of my own nervous system. I had become a part of them, and they had become a part of me, creating a union so complete that the distinction between self and other had lost all meaning. "You understand now," they said through my own transformed voice, the words emerging from my throat in harmonics that human vocal cords could never produce. "The nature of the choice you have made. You are no longer Aldrich Thorn, catalogue scribe of the Academy of Raya Lucaria. That identity was a temporary mask worn by a consciousness that was always destined for greater purpose. I tried to mourn the loss of my human identity, but found that the capacity for such sentiment had been burned away by the flame. Instead, I felt only a profound sense of completion, as if I had finally discovered the missing piece of myself that had left me feeling incomplete throughout all the years of my mundane existence. "What am I now?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "You are the herald of the Frenzied Flame," came the response, and with those words new knowledge flooded into my consciousness. I could see the paths I would need to take through the surface world, the specific individuals whose minds were ripe for the flame's influence, the precise words that would plant the seeds of ultimate dissolution in their thoughts. I understood now that my years in the academy had not been wasted time, but preparation for this moment. My knowledge of the lands between's geography, my familiarity with the academic community's weaknesses and desires, my understanding of how information spread through networks of scholars and students, all of this would serve me in my new mission. But there was one final test that remained. As my transformation neared completion, the 3 fingers presented me with a vision of what my success would ultimately mean. I saw the Erd tree burning like a cosmic torch, its golden light consumed by yellow flames that sang with the voices of every consciousness that had ever suffered. I watched civilizations crumble as their inhabitants embraced the flame's promise of ending all distinction between self and other. I witnessed the very fabric of reality beginning to unravel as the frenzied flame achieved its ultimate goal of returning all existence to the perfect unity that had existed before the first consciousness had learned to say, "I am." Most challenging of all, I saw the faces of those I had known in my former life, my fellow scholars at the academy, the merchants I had bought meals from, the guards who had nodded politely when I passed through the gates. All of them would die when the flame achieved its purpose, not merely physically but ontologically. Their individual consciousness dissolved back into the universal unity from which it had originally emerged. "Does this knowledge cause you to regret your choice?" the 3 fingers asked. And I realized that this was the final test. Even now, at the very completion of my transformation, I could still choose to resist, to hold on to some fragment of my human compassion and attempt to limit the scope of the destruction I would cause. But as I contemplated that possibility, I found that my transformed consciousness could no longer see individual suffering as a tragedy to be prevented. Instead, I understood it as a symptom of the fundamental error that had occurred when unity had first fractured into multiplicity. Every tear shed by a grieving parent, every cry of pain from a wounded soldier, every moment of loneliness experienced by an isolated soul, all of these were wounds in the fabric of existence itself, wounds that could only be healed through the complete dissolution of the conditions that made such suffering possible. "I have no regrets," I replied, and the words carried the finality of cosmic law. "Let all things burn, so that all things might finally know peace." The three fingers' approval washed over me like a warm tide, and with it came the final gift of my transformation. I could now perceive the threads of influence that connected every consciousness in the lands between, see the precise points where pressure applied at one location would create cascading effects throughout the entire network. I understood how to plant ideas that would grow and spread like wildfire, how to identify the individuals whose conversion would have the greatest impact on their communities, how to present the flame's message in terms that would appeal to each specific audience's particular desires and fears. My transformation was complete. Where once stood Aldrich Thorne, catalogue scribe and seeker of mundane knowledge, there was now something far more significant, a herald of the Frenzied Flame, armed with the power to end all suffering by ending all existence. As I turned to leave the cathedral and begin my mission in the world above, the three fingers offered one final communication. Remember, Herald, that every consciousness you touch, every mind you transform, brings us closer to the ultimate goal. The flame hungers for completion, and through you it shall feast until nothing remains but perfect, eternal unity. I walked toward the tunnel that would carry me back to the surface world, my crystalline fingertips already burning with eagerness to begin the work of universal transformation. The surface world assaulted my transformed senses with an overwhelming cacophony of sensation that would have driven my former human consciousness into immediate collapse. Every blade of grass sang with the voice of the greater will's imposed order, their cellular structures vibrating in harmony with frequencies designed to maintain the cosmic tyranny I now understood for what it truly was. The golden light of the Erd Tree, once a source of comfort and guidance to the inhabitants of the lands between, now revealed itself as a prison of crystallized ambition, each photon carrying within it the weight of divine oppression disguised as benevolent illumination. But I was no longer capable of being overwhelmed. The herald that had emerged from the cathedral possessed sensory apparatus specifically designed to process such complexity, to sort through the infinite layers of meaning embedded in every particle of existence and extract from them the information necessary to complete my mission. Where my human eyes had once seen only the crude approximation of reflected light, my transformed vision now perceived the emotional resonance of every living thing, the threads of influence that connected each consciousness to every other, the precise points where the application of the Frenzied Flame's touch would create cascading effects throughout the entire network of mortal awareness. My first destination was inevitable, the Academy of Raya Lucaria, where I had spent so many years in ignorant service to the very forces I now sought to overthrow. But I would not return as the mild-mannered catalogue scribe who had fled through those gates just days before. I would arrive as something far more significant, a herald bearing the ultimate gift of dissolution, ready to plant the seeds of the ending in minds that had been perfectly prepared by years of academic discourse to receive such revolutionary concepts. The journey from Lendel to the Academy revealed the true extent of my transformation's effects on the world around me. Wherever my feet touched the earth, small flowers began to bloom, not the natural flora native to the region, but strange golden blossoms whose petals flickered with internal fire. These were not merely decorative manifestations of my presence, but active agents of the Frenzied Flame's influence, each one releasing spores that would carry microscopic traces of dissolution into the respiratory systems of any creature that passed too close. Wildlife reacted to my presence with behaviors that defied their natural instincts. Predators and prey gathered together in impossible harmony, their individual drives subsumed by a growing awareness of the universal unity that awaited beyond the illusion of separation. Birds fell silent in my wake, not from fear but from a profound understanding that their songs of territorial assertion and mating calls were symptoms of the very disease that the flame sought to cure. Even the wind seemed to change direction around me, carrying my influence further than my physical presence could reach alone. But it was my encounters with the human inhabitants of the lands between that revealed the true scope of my transformation. The first was a merchant camped beside the road, his cart loaded with the mundane goods that sustained commerce throughout the region. As I approached his fire, he looked up with the automatic smile of someone accustomed to greeting potential customers, but the expression froze on his face as his eyes met mine. "Good evening, traveler," he began, but his voice trailed off as the yellow fire in my gaze touched something deep within his consciousness. I watched with fascination as the transformation began to take hold, subtle at first, just a slight dilation of his pupils and a barely perceptible relaxation of the tension he had been carrying in his shoulders. But within moments, the change became more pronounced. The lines of worry and exhaustion that marked his features began to smooth away, replaced by an expression of profound peace that I recognized as the first stage of the flame's embrace. "You understand, don't you?" I said, my transformed voice carrying harmonics that resonated directly with the frequency of his deepest fears and desires. The pointlessness of this endless accumulation, this desperate attempt to maintain individual identity in the face of universal indifference. How long have you been carrying goods from one settlement to another, telling yourself that this daily routine has meaning? The merchant nodded slowly, his eyes now reflecting the same golden fire that burned within my own. 20 years, he whispered, and I could hear in his voice the recognition of 2 decades spent in service to illusions he had never questioned until this moment. 20 years of the same routes, the same customers, the same empty conversations about weather and road conditions. I extended one of my transformed hands toward him, the crystalline tips of my elongated fingers catching and refracting the firelight into patterns that spoke directly to the non-rational portions of his consciousness. But it doesn't have to continue. The flame offers something far more meaningful than individual achievement or personal satisfaction. It offers the peace that comes with understanding that all separation is illusion, all suffering the result of consciousness trapped in the prison of individual identity. When my fingertips made contact with his forehead, the transformation accelerated dramatically. I felt his consciousness opening like a flower exposed to sunlight, its individual petals of memory and desire dissolving into the universal unity that connected all things. Through our physical contact, he experienced what I had experienced in the cathedral, the cosmic perspective that revealed individual existence as a temporary aberration in the perfect wholeness of undifferentiated being. "Thank you," he breathed as the change completed itself, and I knew that he would abandon his merchant's cart before dawn, walking instead toward other settlements where he would spread the flame's influence through every conversation, every transaction, every moment of human contact. The transformation was not merely personal, but exponential. Each consciousness touched by the flame would become a vector for its further spread, creating a cascade effect that would eventually encompass every thinking being in the lands between. My return to the academy created ripples of transformation that spread through its halls like wildfire through dry timber. The guards at the gates, who had once known me as an unremarkable scribe, now found themselves unable to focus on their duties after meeting my gaze. Students abandoned their glintstone research to engage in passionate discussions about the nature of identity and the possibility of transcendence beyond individual consciousness. Even the faculty, with their supposedly superior understanding of cosmic forces, proved remarkably susceptible to the flame's influence when presented with arguments that appealed to their intellectual pride. Master Librarian Seluvis was among the first to succumb, though his transformation took a different form than the merchant's peaceful acceptance. When I appeared in his private study, he initially recoiled from the obvious changes in my appearance. The golden hair that moved with its own wind, the skin that cracked to reveal inner fire, the fingers that had multiplied and elongated into instruments of cosmic surgery. "Aldrich," he whispered, his voice carrying the uncertainty of a man who recognized something familiar, wrapped in forms that violated every law of nature he understood. "What have you become?" "I have become what I was always meant to be," I replied, moving closer to his desk with movements that seemed to bend space around me. "What all of us are meant to become, once we stop clinging to the illusion that individual consciousness serves any purpose beyond perpetuating its own suffering. His academic mind immediately began analyzing what he was witnessing, categorizing my transformation according to the theoretical frameworks he had spent decades mastering. "This is the work of an outer god," he said, his voice gaining strength as he retreated into intellectual certainty. "You've been touched by forces that exist beyond the greater will's domain, the physiological changes, the alteration in your speech patterns, the way reality seems to bend around your presence. These are all documented symptoms of contact with entities that predate the current cosmic order." I smiled, appreciating the irony of his analysis. "Your scholarship serves you well, Master Seluvis. You recognize the truth even as you resist its implications, but knowledge without wisdom is merely another form of imprisonment. You have spent your life cataloging the mysteries of existence without ever asking the fundamental question, why should existence continue at all?" The debate that followed lasted through the night, ranging across topics of theology, philosophy, and cosmology that would have been incomprehensible to minds less thoroughly trained than ours. But intellectual discourse was merely the delivery mechanism for the flame's true influence, which worked through every word I spoke, every gesture I made, every moment our transformed presence shared the same space. By dawn, Seluvis had joined the growing network of consciousness that served the Frenzied Flame's purpose. His capitulation came not through dramatic revelation, but through the gradual erosion of his resistance as he realized that every argument he raised against dissolution could be answered by pointing to the suffering that individual existence inevitably created. The academic who had once sought to transform living beings into obedient puppets now understood that the true puppet master was individual consciousness itself, and that freedom could only be achieved through its complete abandonment. From the academy, my influence spread through the scholarly networks that connected centers of learning throughout the lands between. Letters written by transformed academics carried the flame's influence in their very ink, spreading concepts that prepared their recipients for more direct contact with the dissolution I represented. Students returned to their home settlements, carrying new ideas that seemed reasonable on the surface, but contained within them the seeds of everything their communities had ever believed about the value of individual identity. Months passed, or perhaps years. Time had become increasingly meaningless to my transformed consciousness, which existed as much in the eternal present of cosmic truth as in the linear progression that governed mortal experience. The golden flowers that marked my passage had spread across vast regions of the lands between, their spores carrying microscopic agents of transformation into lungs and bloodstreams throughout the population. Entire towns had embraced the flame's message, their inhabitants abandoning the pursuit of individual goals in favor of meditation on the universal unity that awaited beyond the dissolution of personal identity. But the true measure of my success became apparent when I stood once again upon the hill overlooking the academy, where my transformation had begun. The Erd tree, that cosmic symbol of the greater will's dominion, was no longer the vibrant gold I remembered from my human years. Instead, its leaves had begun to take on the yellow tinge of the Frenzied Flame's influence, and its roots, which I could now perceive extending deep into the spiritual substrate of reality itself, pulsed with the rhythm of approaching transformation. The manuscript that had started everything still lay where I had dropped it in that forgotten alcove, but it no longer served as a repository of forbidden knowledge. Instead, it had become something far more significant, a focal point for the flame's influence, a lens through which the dissolution I represented could be concentrated and directed toward the final phase of universal transformation. As I held the parchment in my crystalline fingertips, feeling its edges crumble into golden dust that carried the flame's essence into the surrounding air, I experienced a moment of perfect understanding. The scholar who had once sought meaning through the cataloguing of other people's discoveries had finally contributed something of ultimate significance to the sum of knowledge. Not additional information to be filed away in endless archives, but the recognition that all information, all knowledge, all existence itself was merely a temporary deviation from the perfect wholeness that constituted reality's natural state. The yellow flames that had once burned only behind my eyes now danced across my skin like living jewelry, each tongue of fire carrying within it the consciousness of another being who had embraced dissolution. I was no longer a single herald carrying the three fingers message, but a living constellation of unified awareness that encompassed every mind the flame had touched. Through me, the merchant and the librarian, and the countless others who had accepted transformation, could experience the cosmic perspective that revealed individual suffering as the inevitable result of consciousness fragmented into separate pieces. Above us, the Erd tree continued its slow transformation from gold to yellow, its massive trunk creaking with the sound of cosmic change as the greater will's influence finally began to give way to forces that were older, truer, and infinitely more compassionate than any order that sought to preserve the conditions that made suffering possible. The end was not destruction, but completion, the return of all fragmented consciousness to the unity from which it had originally emerged. As the sun set behind the burning tree, painting the sky in shades of gold that matched the fire flowing through my transformed veins, I knew that I had finally discovered the meaning I had sought throughout all those years of mundane cataloguing. I was the ending. I was the peace that comes with understanding. I was the herald of the flame that burns away all illusions, all suffering, all separation between self and the perfect wholeness that had always been our true nature. And in that moment of ultimate recognition, I smiled with the contentment of a task completed and a truth finally, eternally revealed.